Hey guys, welcome to today's video on the bureaucracy. Today we are going to be talking about discretionary and rulemaking authority. So we're really getting into what the bureaucracy does. This is like the nuts and bolts. So in this video and in the set of notes, you're looking at the concept of bureaucratic discretion. What does that mean? And also explaining how the bureaucracy then uses that discretionary authority for rulemaking and implementation of policy. So, where does bureaucratic power come from, right? Because we know that this is not this is a part of the executive branch. This isn't its own thing. So, where does this power come from? The bureaucracy ultimately has the power, the authority to implement or carry out and enforce government policy. So, right, this is the arm, the piece of the government that is, once a law is created, that makes sure that it gets carried out. So, the power for this, the authority for this from the Constitution comes from Congress. And that is a huge, as we will come to see later, a huge check on the power of the bureaucracy. So Congress is what creates, guides, and funds the bureaucratic departments and agencies. So it literally gives out money. When we start talking about the budget, you'll see kind of the push and pull, the conflict, the competition for pieces of the budget that these agencies have. And then Congress also creates new departments and agencies as well and gives them a guide as to what they are supposed to be doing through the laws that they pass. So, how exactly does the bureaucracy implement and enforce government policy, right? So, it's going to come from Congress, the power of Congress. But to do this, Congress gives the bureaucracy the ability to make rules and regulations, enforce those regulations, and then issue fines. So, in this part of the government, Congress is going to leave the specifics of how to implement policy up to the bureaucratic agencies. And this is what is known as delegated discretionary authority. The power to ultimately, of the bureaucracy, interpret legislation and create rules that decide the specifics of how the laws will be executed. Yeah. So you can think about it like this. In a class, like you're in a school setting, education, right? As a teacher, I am told what I have to teach you by College Board, for instance, right? That would be like our Congress in this example. College Board tells me that I have to teach you about discretionary authority of the bureaucracy. Now, as a teacher, I'm like this bureaucratic agency, right? I am a piece of the bureaucracy that is meant to teach you this subject. And I, based on my discretion, I have the ability to interpret what College Board has given me to teach, and I have the discretion to decide how I teach it, right? So, for instance, I give these lecture notes as a video, whereas Mr. Coughlin, Mr. Funk, Mr. Taylor might do it in class, right? So that is my discretion. It's up to my interpretation and how I want to teach. So I have my own choices there. So that's kind of what this discretionary authority is, right? Laws are, as we will see, sometimes not very specific. So Congress leaves this power to interpret the legislation and create rules up to the bureaucracy. And this is also known as rulemaking, essentially making regulations that have the force of law. Now, why it's considered delegated is because Congress knows that it doesn't have the time or the experts, as we'll see in a second, to actually do what the bureaucracy does and make these regulations. So Congress actually transfers this authority to this bureaucracy, these agencies. So here's an example of what I'm talking about here. Congress, we know, is our lawmaking body of government. They'll pass a law that says that large labels must be placed on hazardous household chemical products. That's what the law says. Now, as we will practice in class, you'll see that that's actually pretty vague. I can think of a couple of things, but an example of the bureaucracy, using its discretion and creating rules is going to be the FDA. Okay, the FDA, using its discretion, decides and interprets what this law means, and they'll create a rule that sets further guidelines for what is considered hazardous. right? What is hazardous? What defines hazardous? Okay, that's part of what the bureaucracy does. And we will practice this in class, but this is an example. Now, it is in the interest of the bureaucracy as an institution to create more regulations and thus have more to implement, right? Yes, the bureaucracy takes laws from Congress and creates these regulations. But the reason the bureaucracy wants more regulations is because more regulations means that you need larger or more, I should say, employees. Your bureaucracy needs to be bigger in order to enforce regulations, right? You need more people to actually make sure that those regulations are being followed. More employees and more regulations also means a bigger budget. And a bigger budget means you have more power over other agencies. So this has kind of created one of the criticisms of the bureaucracy, or the bureaucracy has become bloated and too large. So why discretionary authority, right? Why did Congress delegate this power to the bureaucratic part of the executive branch? First and foremost, it saves time. It is more efficient than Congress determining every detail of every law. Okay. A thing that goes along with this is Congress also doesn't have the expertise always. So laws in this particular instance are left intentionally vague. Right, few of the 535 members of Congress who helped pass the act or the bill are experts in that subject. So they delegate or transfer the authority to the agency or commission or department that are the experts, right? So, for example, like let's say that there's a bill passed by Congress and signed into law dealing with the environment, right? Congress doesn't necessarily have the expertise to write a detailed law about environmental regulation. So they delegate that authority to the EPA, and they entrust the EPA to then make sure that the point of the bill, the goal of the bill, is being accomplished. Okay, and the EPA does that by creating regulations and rules. Compromise is also a thing here, right? Laws are hard enough to pass without having to agree on every detail. Congress knows that the likelihood of a bill being passed is usually if the bill is a little bit more vague. The more detail that is added, the more there is to disagree on. These rules and regulations are also used to ensure uniformity and consistency across the government. And there's actually a pro for Congress here too, right? I mean, Congress itself, they're up for reelection pretty frequently, especially the House. Right? A congressperson might see a need to enact an unpopular regulation, right? Like maybe that is increasing taxes, for instance, but they don't want the blame that comes from being the name behind that regulation, because that would drop their approval rating. So basically, Congress can kind of use the bureaucracy almost as like a scapegoat to maybe keep up their approval rating a little bit. All right, now let's talk about a little bit more of these rules and regulations. They all contain the following elements. First and foremost, as we've talked about, they get their power from Congress. These rules and regulations mention that. And also, they have a set of directions from Congress. Congress gives in the bill or law their mission, their goal, what they want the agency to do, or a broad guideline, right? Next, the agency, the commission, will set a rule and guideline, right? They'll use that discretionary authority and interpret the law to create or establish how it should be implemented. And then the rule and regulation also has a way of enforcing compliance with that goal and agency regulations. And we'll talk about compliance here in a second. So as a result of these elements, agencies are both quasi-legislative, meaning the regulations are like laws, and they're also quasi-judicial. So they do settle disputes and make rulings as well. So again, just another example here, right? Like when we talk about quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, right? The FCC, which we'll take a look at, they can identify what is indecent for televised broadcasts, right? The Federal Communications Commission decides what is indecent, what can and cannot be shown on TV. So this here, right, there is a need for some way to force compliance with that regulation, whatever it is that they decide. Consequences exist for failing to follow rules and regulations. And the biggest example of this is compliance monitoring. I've mentioned my father-in-law before. This is what he did for the Ohio EPA. His responsibility was to make sure that firms and companies are following the standards and provisions set by the bureaucratic agency. If they don't, there are fines involved. So compliance monitoring involves, collecting evidence, documenting compliance or non-compliance, maybe testifying in court, for example, if things don't go or if the company or firm is not abiding by the regulation. And as a result, the bureaucracy is continually evaluating and creating new rules and refining old ones. And that's not only, due to this compliance monitoring, but executive orders from the president might shape how the president wants certain laws or the agencies to function. Public opinion, new congressional laws, right? So these rules and regulations are constantly evolving, as well as the consequences for failing to comply. Now, there is supposed transparency in rulemaking. A lot of people criticize this, but the Administrative Procedures Act makes the rulemaking process transparent and ensures that citizens and industries affected by the policy have input in shaping it. So this is an access point for people to, have their opinions known by the government itself. Sometimes there are rulemaking hearings, like they're public, sometimes they happen online, but all of this information is available. And agencies and bureaucratic departments take note of this, and they know that if a new rule is necessary, they study the issue, they meet with experts, they research problems, they consult industry officials, lobbyists, citizens. Everything is documented. And due to the complexity of all of this stuff, it is required by law that this information, these regulations about what is being implemented is in the Federal Register, which is the daily journal of the United States government. Now, we have talked about independent agencies and commissions a little bit. They have a role in this as well, a pretty big role. So remember that these independent regulatory agencies and commissions are not represented in the cabinet. They don't fit into a cabinet department, and they are not part of the executive office of the president. Remember, this is because they either don't fit well into a department, they require protection from partisan and politics, or might be unique and sensitive in nature, like the CIA. Agencies have a director, administrations as well. That's just something to note. And commissions have a board or chairperson. So it's a group. And these agencies and commissions, from here on out, I'm going to use them like interchangeably, guys. They're given unique charges or tasks from Congress to enforce or regulate industry-specific law. And when I say industry-specific law, think about the EPA, right? Their focus is on regulating environmental policy. The FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, looking at campaign finance. The FCC, communications, right? We'll talk about that in class, but it's like television, right? Media, broadcast, things like that. Because they're independent, the president has less influence on implementation and enforcement than the dependent agencies that fall under his cabinet control, right? He nominates members of the cabinet who then regulate and monitor the departments that are under them. If these agencies and commissions are independent of the cabinet, the president by proxy doesn't have as much control or influence. Additionally, the boards especially have staggered terms. The agencies as well, the directors have staggered terms to ensure that the president can't come in once they're elected and wipe out the entire board and completely replace them with his own chosen appointees. And unlike the cabinet and his staff, these, board members, chair people cannot be easily removed by the president. The president can recommend or work with independent agencies, but they do have less influence than other agencies themselves. Now, deregulation is the final thing we're going to talk about here. We kind of are going to talk about this in the context of federalism as well. So deregulation has been the trend since the late 70s and early 80s of lifting government restrictions on business, industry, professional activities. The idea is that the size of the federal government has gotten too big. The number and complexity of these regulations and these policies has made it way too complicated, made it way too burdensome. So I'm going to challenge you guys. We're going to talk about it in class a little bit, but I want you to start thinking about, maybe jot some notes down. How does this connect to new federalism and devolution? So think back to Unit 2, right? This is where our course is connecting all of the pieces together. How does this deregulation connect to new federalism and devolution? Okay. So we talked about bureaucratic discretion and how the bureaucracy uses delegated discretionary authority for rulemaking and implementation. Make sure to let me know if you have any questions, jot them down, upload the form or upload photos of your notes if you won't be in class, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.